Hi boys and girls, welcome to our story time today. Today we are going to read Mr. Noisy. Here it is. Mr. Noisy is red with orange shoes. Mr. Noisy was a very, very noisy person indeed. For example, if Mr. Noisy was reading this story to you, he'd be shouting at the top of his voice. And the top of Mr. Noisy's voice is a very loud place indeed. You can hear it 100 miles away. Wow, that's far. For example, when most people sneeze, you can hear them in the next room. But a tissue! When Mr. Noisy sneezes, you can hear him in the next country. Mary me, Mary D. He must have a very loud sneeze. Now this story starts when Mr. Noisy was asleep in bed, in his bedroom, in his house, which is on top of a hill. That's like yesterday when we read Mr. Jelly. Mr. Jelly's story started when he was in bed too. There's Mr. Noisy's house at the top of the hill. He was snoring, and as you can well imagine, when Mr. Noisy snores, that is a snore worth hearing. It sounds more like a herd of elephants than a snore. Then Mr. Noisy's alarm clock went off. Mr. Noisy's alarm clock sounds like no other alarm in the world. It sounds more like a fire engine. Mr. Noisy woke up. And so too did all the people who lived in Wobbletown, which is at the bottom of Mr. Noisy's hill. That's a funny place to live, Wobbletown. I wonder if everyone wobbles when they're walking around. Later that day, Mr. Noisy decided that he had to go shopping. He went out of his house, shutting the door behind him. Bang! The door wobbled, the house wobbled, the whole hill wobbled. Wobbletown wobbled. Even a bird flying high above wobbled. Oh, everything does wobble. That was a good guess and we were right. Then Mr. Noisy walked down the hill. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the baker's shop. Crash went the door when he opened it. Bang went the door when he shut it. "I'd like a loaf of bread," boomed Mr. Noisy to Mrs. Crumb, the baker's wife. Mrs. Crumb trembled and sold him a loaf. Oh, she's a bit afraid of his loud voice. She doesn't like it. I don't like it when people shout or are too loud either. I prefer a nice quiet voice. Then Mr. Noisy walked along the street to the butcher. Clump, clump, clump. He walked into the butcher's shop. Crash went the door when he opened it. Bang went the door when he shut it. "I'd like a piece of meat," boomed Mr. Noisy to Mr. Bacon the butcher. Mr. Bacon trembled and sold him some meat. Oh, look. He's nervous too. He doesn't like it when Mr. Noisy shouts. Maybe somebody should tell Mr. Noisy. What do you think? I think you're right. Afterwards, Mrs. Crumb met Mr. Bacon in the street. "We really must do something about Mr. Noisy being so noisy," she said. "I know," said Mrs. Crumb, and she whispered into Mr. Bacon's ear. Mr. Bacon smiled a small smile, which grew into a broad grin. "Mrs. Crumb," he said, "I think you have the answer." They have a plan. I wonder what their plan is. Let's find out. The following day, Mr. Noisy went shopping again. Clump, clump, clump. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. "I'd like a loaf of bread," he boomed. "Sorry, what did you say?" said Mrs. Crumb, pretending not to hear. "I'd like a loaf of bread," Mr. Noisy shouted. "Sorry," said Mrs. Crumb. "Can you speak up, please? I can't hear you." "I'd like a loaf of bread," roared Mr. Noisy. Can't hear you, said Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy gave up and stomped out. He's not happy that he couldn't get his bread. Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Mr. Bacon pretended not to notice. I'd like a piece of meat, Mr. Noisy shouted. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. I said I'd like a piece of meat, roared Mr. Noisy. Pardon? Said Mr. Bacon. Mr. Noisy gave up and went out and went home and went to bed hungry. Look, he's very disappointed. I think they should tell him that he's using a loud voice. He might not know. The day after, Mr. Noisy tried again. He went into Mrs. Crumb's shop. I'd like a loaf of bread, he boomed. A what? Asked Mrs. Crumb. Mr. Noisy started shouting at the top of his voice. A loaf of... And then he stopped and he thought. And then he said quietly, I'd like a loaf of bread, please, Mrs. Crumb. Mrs. Crumb smiled. Certainly, she said, and she went to get him a loaf of bread. Then Mr. Noisy went into Mr. Bacon's shop. I'd like a piece of meat, he boomed. Did you say something? Asked Mr. Bacon. Yes, I did, shouted Mr. Noisy at the very, very top of his voice. I said I'd like a... And then he stopped, and then he thought, and then he said quietly, I'd like a piece of meat, please, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon smiled. My pleasure. Oh, he's using a lovely voice now. He's not shouting anymore. So carrying his bread and his meat, Mr. Noisy set off home up the hill. Clump, clump, clump. Then he stopped. Then he thought. And then do you know what he did? He tiptoed. A tiptoe was something Mr. Noisy had never tried before. It was fun. Maybe you should try tiptoeing around your house. See if you can sneak up on anyone and give them a fright. Mr. Noisy arrived at his front door. He put out his hand to open the door, and then he stopped, and then he thought, and then do you know what he did? He opened the door very quietly. He stepped inside, and then he shut the door very gently. Quietly and gently were two things Mr. Noisy had never tried before either. That was fun too. There he is. He's so relaxed. And do you know something? From then until now, Mr. Noisy isn't anything like as noisy as he used to be. And do you know something else? The people of Wobbletown are delighted, especially Miss Crumb and Mr. Bacon. And do you know something else? Mr. Noisy has learned how to whisper. Wow! That was so good. Well done, Mr. Noisy. If he was in our class, what would we give him? A sticker? I think you're right. We would give him a sticker because he's trying so hard to be quiet and not to upset the people in the village anymore. So remember yesterday we sung a Christmas song, which is a little bit silly, but we've one more Christmas song to do today, and then we're moving on to other songs tomorrow. So our song today is our Christmas Hokey Pokey. So remember this? Okay, so 1, 2, 3. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. And that's what it's all about. Put your donkey tail in, your donkey tail out. In, out, shake it all about. You do the hokey pokey and you turn around. That's what it's all about. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. And that's what it's all about. Put your bauble in, your bauble out. In, out, shake it all about. You do the hokey pokey and you turn around. And that's what it's all about. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. And that's what it's all about. Put your Santa hat on. Very good, are you ready? Put your Santa hat in, put your Santa hat out. In, out, shake it all about. Do the hokey pokey and you turn around. And that's what it's all about. Hands up. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. Oh, hokey pokey pokey. And that's what it's all about. Hooray! And we're finished. That was a great sing-song, boys and girls. So today's Tuesday, tomorrow's Wednesday, and tomorrow we will read number 17 in our Mr. Men series. So tomorrow we are going to be on Mr. Lazy. So I will see you tomorrow for Mr. Lazy.